Well, I think if you're going through a divorce or a separation, and you got to vent about your issues and you got to deal with, and you need some honest advice, talk to your attorney. And I know that's expensive, but but you know,
Start
maybe
there
one
first.
hour of a good attorney would be 10 hours worth of therapy, right? I don't know. But also, if you say to the attorney, look, I need somebody to talk to, besides the legal issues, who do you recommend? Just like you go to your family doctor, what therapist do you recommend? That's where people find out things. Um, I think that also the other thing is that compared to generations past, men do not belong to fraternal organizations as much. Um,
Right. Right.
I'm a
The
Mason,
brotherhood.
and I find being with the guys and Masons that makes me a stronger person to deal with the adversity of life.
Thank you guys. Welcome back to another episode of Men Suffer in Silence. Today we have another special guest.
Yes, sir.
I'll let you go ahead and kick it off there.
Yes, our special guest is Lance. Lance, I'm gonna let you go ahead and give yourself a quick intro. Let them know who you are, what you do, and how you got into what you're into.
Welcome, Lance.
Yes, my name's Lance Hillsinger. I'm a retired child welfare social worker. I worked for 29 years with San Luis Obispo County and 5 years before that with Los Angeles County. For most of my career, I handled court cases of one type or another. And then in retirement, I've written 4 books. The first of which is In Place of the Parent, Inside Child Protective Services, which traces my career in child welfare, talks about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the system. Then so many of the families that came in the court system qualified for court-appointed attorneys. They were poor enough, and in California, we appoint attorneys. That's not true in some states. The juvenile proceedings are sometimes considered civil proceedings, and so the parents had to represent themselves in some states. So I wrote a book about Poverty Build a Better Bridge, Social Policy for the 21st Century. Then a fun little book, Beyond Amelia, Lesser Known Women of Yesteryear. That was mostly a marketing thing to hopefully draw women into reading my other books. And then my last book, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul, A Court Investigator Examines the Gospels. I looked through the Gospels as if this evidence was something I was considering for writing a court report to the juvenile court.
Wow, that's amazing.
Okay.
Right, amazing.
Okay.
Amazing.
Right.
So let's jump right into it. Lance, so the silence, father in the system. During your 34 years as a court investigator, for the Child Protective Services, you likely saw families at their breaking point. Did you observe patterns of fathers suffering in silence, feeling like they had no voice in the system, or in their emotional pain was secondary to the bureaucratic process?
Well, I think there's an important point to make that while I handle just court cases, the vast majority of cases in child welfare are non-court. We do an industrial investigation, and most of the time that does not result in court intervention. Sometimes there's nothing substantiated. Sometimes there is, and we handled it informally. Most of the times, very rarely, is the biological mother in the home. The typical case is the mother and her boyfriend or the mother alone. I only had a handful of cases where I had both biological parents in the home. So if we handle a case as a non-court, informal situation, the father isn't made aware of that intervention and of whatever issue brought it. So there was some issue, maybe not enough to bring it to court, and the father's left in the dark about that. And, that's to give the mother, some sense of privacy that she's going to deal with her own problems. But I would flip it around. I would say, well, if you were the mother and the father had some issue in his home, wouldn't you want to know what was going on? So I think that there's a lot of silence here. I think when they get to court cases, they're usually represented by an attorney, like I said, in California, unless if the only times I had it happen was the father was what we call the non-offending father. He was out of the home when it happened. We located him, and maybe he's been an involved father all along, or maybe he hasn't. And so we, incorporate him into it. I think one of the things that point out, though, one of my first podcasts I appeared on was Child Welfare Leaders. A black woman, hosted this program, and I pointed out that when a man goes in the courtroom, very likely his attorney is a woman, the social worker's a woman, the other attorneys are women, 50-50 chance the judge is a woman, he's going to feel a little out of place, even if everyone was asking professionals. And so she really got that. She really got that idea that, I find that the fathers would, there's no like one type of father, but there's different types of situations. You often had the involved father who was completely innocent, and very quickly the system would release his kids to him. And then you had some who, they were in trouble with themselves. Maybe they were not part of the offense or a situation that led to the courtroom, but they're sitting in jail on an unrelated charge, on nothing to do with child abuse, or they're sitting in jail or prison. And they can kind of feel very hopeless about that. And then sometimes there's a general hopelessness because there's a lot of fathers who are like, they weren't abusive, but they weren't winners. They weren't successful in life in general. And so they just kind of felt like the world's against me, and this just happens to be one of the examples of that.
Right. Gotcha.
That makes sense.
Yes, it does.
That makes sense.
Now, when you have stoicism versus trauma, social work is an incredibly high trauma profession. Do you think men in the social welfare and investigative fields often suffer in silence because of the societal expectations to remain stoic and strong and to face the horrific cases they handle?
I think most of the time, men and women act professionally. They take their the stress and they handled it professionally in a manner. So they're strong, whether they're men or women, by and large. Few times I've seen few women have, I won't say breakdowns, that's a little too extreme of a word, but frustrations, venting their frustrations in a way that I wouldn't be able to do so. And I kind of prided myself. I'm kind of a calm person anyways. I'm not that talkative. I'm not that outgoing. And I was kind of known as just being the guy who was stable, but I didn't think of it as me being a stable person, not so much a stable guy, and being unshakable. And once you get in, you've been a social worker for a couple of years, it's not the clients that are difficult, it's the systems and the frustrations with the system, like shortage of foster homes. That will cause you a lot more frustration than a difficult client once you've got so many years of experience. Though I think you do hit a good point here about stoicism. There's some books that I've read about this. There's an interesting book, Think Like an Emperor, the musings of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoicism. And it's written by a psychologist, and it talks about the importance of how this Roman emperor, a lot of things were happening, but he still did his emperor duties. He still took care of things. And one of the things another book I want to talk about this is, and I'm going to tie this back into child welfare, but here's an example. Bob Iger, who was the CEO of Disney, several years ago, I don't know if you remember, there was a child that was killed by a crocodile, an alligator, or I don't know if it was alligator or crocodile, at Disney World. And Iger calls the family to offer his condolences. The very next day, Disney World in Hong Kong opened. He's got to put on Mr. Happy Face. There's billions of dollars to save tens of thousands of jobs, and he has to be stoic. And somehow we don't celebrate that as much. We don't teach people that you sometimes do have to put on the happy face, and because that's what's expected of you. So
I would say more often than not, you have to put that face on.
Definitely.
Yeah, but somehow that it's a bad thing to put on it, to be kind of dishonest with your feelings. I'm sure he was upset having a child die at his theme park and having this very emotional telephone call with the family, who's probably calling him all sorts of names or whatever. They're not going to be kind to him at that moment, and then having to suck it up. But somehow we say that sucking it up is not the thing to do, is being dishonest. And I thought sometimes you do have to do that.
No, I agree.
And one of the things that I said I was going to tie this back to child welfare. I had a kid in my caseload who was being a brat in the classroom. He was just being a brat. And so I went to talk to him in school when he was doing okay in the foster home, but he was really being a brat in class. And I told him, look, what if your teacher had a flat tire on the way to school? And then after she's changed her tire, she's running behind, she drives too fast, she gets a speeding ticket. Okay, and now would you expect her to still be a good teacher? Well, yeah. And then I recapitulated the flat tires that this boy had in his life, and I said, you wouldn't bring that into the classroom, just as your teacher couldn't bring her literal flat tire. And it, I don't say it worked 100%, but I think that it helped. And I said, mature people, that's a sign of maturity, that you divorce the bad feeling and you tend to the task at hand.
Right.
Makes sense.
We have a short term for that called manning up. Kind of manning up.
Yeah.
Yep. So barriers to asking for help is in your book. In place of the parent, you discuss the inner workings of the system. From your experience, what is the biggest barrier preventing men, fathers, grandfathers, or even male social workers from raising their hands and saying, I'm not okay, and when families are failing or falling apart?
Well, I think that, I'd handle little court cases, so we would have a case plan and would say, okay, mother, you have to do these things to get your kids back. Father, you have to do these other things to get your kids back. The fathers tended to have longer lists because they tended to have more problems. Mm-hmm. And it's important to remember about 2/3 of my cases deal with neglect due to substance abuse, with domestic violence being like the second thing. So
gotcha.
like you don't get to choose your terms and conditions of probation. Your terms and conditions to get your child back are given to you by the court system. We're supposed to have input from the parent and one thing, but I have a beef with that because you don't get to write your own case plan. If you have an anger problem, you're going to try not to avoid. One of the things people don't want to work on themselves. It's a pride thing. You don't want to.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
And so the system says that we're supposed to incorporate the parent, and I would do that. Yes, I would try to sell them on the idea, but they don't get to choose how they get better. Because a lot of people would say, I could just, I can go party with my friends, I'll feel better or whatever about myself.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's not an option. And so there would be very specifics. Going to counseling was often hard for both men and women, but I think particularly for women because you have to have a DSM diagnosis to get treatment through mental health, through county mental health, and through, and if you're just going through a stressful situation, but you don't fit a DSM category, it's very hard, and to get that. And then if you want to get a handful of my clients did have private insurance. And then I would ask them to go through, see what therapists. And for people who are listening, Psychology Today has a program where you log into Psychology Today, it will say, find a therapist. But if you don't think to filter for gender, you have to scroll down several people until you find a guy. I just tested it this morning.
Right.
And then
wow.
And back to the book, Build a Better Bridge, one of the things I point out is that since about 2012, more women have become psychologists than men. And in the other things like licensed clinical social worker has always been more women than men. And women feel more comfortable seeing a female therapist, a male generally more comfortable with a male therapist. If there's not the supply, that's another issue. Besides money and insurance and time and all those things, there's just a supply issue.
Just a quick outside question here is, why do you think men don't want to fill these positions anymore?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Why do men don't want to do what?
Why do you think men don't want to fill these positions? Why don't men go for these positions? Why is it so dominated by women?
That's a tough question to answer. I think it's all sorts of things, I was always the sensitive kid, so maybe that's why I gravitated to social work and wasn't very athletic. So an athletic scholarship was never in my picture,
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that, if I looked at the Journal of Social Work, if you look at research projects that are gone, they're not about men generally. Even though men make up, 50% or 50% of the population, there's not a lot of studies out there. There are studies about all sorts of things that people that other issues they're more interested in. So I think that that's a shame, because I think we need to focus more on that, on what programs will bring men. We did a very good program locally for domestic violence, men helping men. Under California law, if a man is found guilty of domestic violence, he has to go to a 52-week program, and that program is very good. And very men were successful about it. No program has a perfect track record, but they were helpful. But they had to pay for it. It was like, I think, $75 a session.
Oh, wow.
So for our audience out there that may be in search of a therapist, would you suggest that a man finds a man therapist and female find a female therapist?
Well, I think it depends on the person. I mean, sometimes people have issues with their dad, and maybe the last person you want is a male therapist, maybe,
Right.
But I think in general, people will, whichever you feel more comfortable with. And people will generally know what they have in their mind, older, younger,
Now, how do you relate talk therapy with hypnotherapy?
Well, I'm not qualified in hypnotherapy. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying far as the difference.
Between men and women in therapy? Therapist?
Talk therapy and hypnotherapy.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in hypnotherapy, so I don't want to comment about that.
Okay, I got you.
Gotcha. So, do you feel that the current social policies that overlook the mental health crisis among men, particularly those in low-income brackets, who feel like they have that has failed them, like the providers have kind of failed them because they're in a low-income bracket?
I think there's a point, and then in my book, Build a Better Bridge, Social Policy for the 21st Century, I point out that since the 1990s, the number of manufacturing jobs, which is generally male-dominated jobs, is about 2/3 of what it was. A little bit higher, a little lower, but roughly it hasn't bounced around no matter which parties have been elected. It's about 2/3. And those are jobs that men used to have. And that the instability of jobs, for instance, if you look at jobs that have a lot of security, policemen, fire, nurses, and teachers, those jobs are pretty much recession-proof. Those are recession-proof jobs. But if you add up all the nurses and teachers together, add up all the police officers and firefighters together, it's about an 8-to-1 margin. So there are more jobs providing for women that provide financial stability that are recession-proof. I had a lot of guys on my case who work in construction. If you work in a backhoe operator and you're a heavy machine operator and you find work, you've got pretty good money. But how often, especially in a small county like San Luis Obispo, is there a demand for heavy machine operators? So it's a boom or bust kind of thing in construction jobs. And so I think that is sometimes, I was on a conservative talk show, and they talked about how people, were claiming that people are lazy and all this stuff, and that people on welfare, and I'm going, you have to have opportunity to have the jobs. To that. And yes, it's going to be hard. And then, again, it's not something you could be all depressed because you haven't found a decent job, but that doesn't mean you meet a DSM criteria. You have to be sort of sick. You have to be really depressed to meet the criteria to be considered. And so it's like, well, what if I'm just kind of ticked off at the world because I've gone to 5 job interviews and haven't been hired yet, or there haven't been any job interviews in my area?
Right.
No, definitely that. So, the evolution of fatherhood. You've appeared on podcasts like Feel Good Fatherhood. How have you seen the role in the fathers change over your career? Do you think the modern fathers are better at breaking the silence regarding their struggles, or they're just facing new and different pressures that keep them quiet?
Well, there's how many millions of men in America? Probably there's a lot of different variety there. So it's hard to make generalizations. I do think that there's fewer role models for men. And I was just thinking about your question, and like when I was growing up, you had the Jetsons and the Flintstones as cartoons, and you had the dad in the home, and he was active. But what did we have when my kids were growing up? We had SpongeBob, as a male character,
Yeah.
And then I think that you don't see many positive. I think maybe it was overemphasized, the father role being sort of the patriarch kind of thing. That was maybe overrized in television of the 60s and the 70s and was all white, But you also see now men portrayed as stupid, a lot in television. And so I think it is harder. I think that, at least as far as caseload goes, this is just one interesting thing. When I first started in child welfare, DNA testing wasn't very sophisticated, and you had to do a blood draw. And paternity testing's something that we have to do fairly often in child welfare. Who's the father? And so many men were resistant to having their blood drawn to get the DNA analysis. But now it's a swab in the mouth, and the cooperation factor jumped when it was that when you only had a swab. And I also found out that there were fewer men that usually we were more involved, that they stayed in touch with the mom or whatever, and so the number of paternity testing issues declined over my career, and fathers are more interested, and the court system has always wanted to, with equal facts on each side, they're supposed to treat men and women equally, and then that's always been the law. But arranging visitation, and there's been more active role of trying to make sure that the father does have visitation and getting that accomplished. And so if you have separate visitation, separate for the mother, no separate visitation for the father, and each set of grandparents, got a lot of visitation for the social worker to arrange. But I do find that most of them, and one of the things I would talk about is that there were some guys on my caseload who could get down on the floor and play with their kids and play toys and watch cartoons and things like that. But their personal lives were messed up. They were doing drugs or whatever. They kept it away from the home or whatever. But they were messed up, so we couldn't get their kids back. That's a shame. But I do think that when I would encounter fathers that would enjoy their children shooting baskets or whatever it was, I would kind of praise it. I say, I see you enjoy that. I try to make it sound sincere. It was sincere, but I know people get jaded very easily, so I try to keep the comments as brief so that it would sound sincere. But I do think that there was most guys wanted to be involved in fathers, and a lot of them were just ignorant.
It makes sense.
They didn't know they didn't have a role model in their own lives, and so they didn't know quite what to do.
Do you find that a lot of the families in your caseload did not have a father in the household?
Or a bad one. A mediocre dad in the home is better than none at all.
That's fair.
Yeah. But very often people did not have a father in the home, or there was an abusive father. But it's not that simple. People say, this father abused his kid because he was abused. Sure, there's some truth to that, but it's not as, I think, cut and dry as some people believe it to be. But one of the things I would ask about people is, how were you raised? And were there times when you knew I wouldn't quite have put it this way, but did they have a regular childhood, or more or less regular childhood growing up at some time? And I said, wouldn't you want that for your kids now?
Right.
That makes sense. Yeah, definitely.
Wow.
And you say you're still actively doing this now, or you retired?
I've been retired 7 years now.
Okay. How's that
Yeah.
going for you?
Well, some days are boring, but I try to find purpose by doing podcasts and writing books and trying to do my part.
Okay.
Just to say that the royalties for my book, In Place of the Parent, Inside Child Protective Services, all the royalties go directly to Razom, a humanitarian program in Ukraine.
Wow.
Okay.
And,
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Wow.
and we'll actually have that information. We'll list that below so everyone can see. And if anybody wants to donate, they'll be able to donate as well. So
Great.
faith as a refuge or as a hiding place, like you mentioned in your new book, or in your new look at the Gospels, you examine Jesus through the lens of an investigator. In your view, do men often use faith or lack of it as a way to mask their suffering, or do you see it as one of the few outlets that they go able to have them feel safe enough to be vulnerable?
I think that church attendance by men and women is a fraction of it was in previous generations. And this is I'll get to your point, but just to say this very quickly, during the pandemic of flu pandemic in 1917, just before that, I should say, but just before that, there was a suicide rate was half of the suicide rate before COVID. And I think part of the reason is that people had faith a lot more. Going to church or going to worship was part of the fabric of daily life in 1917. It was the fabric of life during COVID. And so I think that faith kind of helped people cope. So with life. So that said, for everyone, men and women, that faith helps you cope with the challenges. I do think that men come in, the people who have known, who we knew were regular, go to church, or one fellow who was Jewish, he was popular and he was well liked. That there's a certain thing that people of faith have, that they see kindness more readily than people, and then people like that, and so they're more popular and they're more trustworthy, I think, because they trust in God. And so I think that there's a salutary effect there in your secular world if you go to church or worship any faith. As far as a refuge, I do think that people would feel comfortable going to a pastor. I used to tell people that, before we had mental health counseling, where did people go? They went to their priest, their minister, and their rabbi to deal with their problems.
Right.
And presumably most of the time that helped. And so when anyone had any inclination to a church, I said, yeah, that's good. That's very good. And go there and feel that, if like the old saying that says, Jesus loved me because the Bible tells me so. If you learn that as a child, that can carry with you and through the tough times in life, whether man or woman. And I think that if you, in traditional church, you confess your sins, maybe privately, or you confess to a priest privately, but, out loud, that tells you okay, I did wrong, but I'm going to be a better person. And I think that's the big hump in therapy for a lot of people. Yeah, I have this problem in my life. I've got to admit this problem. I've got to admit that this is what I got to work on. And that's a big hump. And it's hard. And I think this is just a personal beef. I think that our society is so... employment is more difficult. You are monitored more closely. Both my daughter's a teacher, and the amount of paperwork that she has to accumulate, her lessons plan have to match certain guidelines with the state. My mother was a teacher. She just did whatever case plan came to her mind for that day, with the kids.
Right.
There's less. Right. And you go to a bank, and every time I don't go in-person banking very often, but every time that I do, there's a little thing. How was your teller? And then you imagine being the teller, constantly being evaluated, and
Right.
your supervisor is going to talk to you about the one customer who didn't like you, then as opposed to the 25 who did. And then you have to go to church and say, hey, I'm a sinner. That's hard. If you've been already kind of called on the carpet for something in your secular life, and then you say, "Hey, God, I messed up too." And it's like, wait, I need to feel a strength here. So I think there's some fault
Right.
in this, in how society is now, that makes it hard for men, maybe men in particular, to say, "Hey, yeah, I do have these problems," because somebody's on your case about something all the time, whether it's a boss or paperwork or whatever. The monitoring is so much higher.
That is very true.
It makes sense, yeah.
Very, very, very true. So, advice for the strong man. It says many men listening might be currently navigating the family court system or dealing with separation, feeling like they have to be a rock for everyone else while crumbling inside. So, based on your decades of experience, what is your message to the man about the value of breaking his silence?
Well, I think if you're going through a divorce or a separation, and you got to vent about your issues and you got to deal with, and you need some honest advice, talk to your attorney. And I know that's expensive, but maybe 1 hour of a good attorney would be 10 hours worth of therapy, right? I don't know. But also, if you say to the attorney, "Look, I need somebody to talk to, besides the legal issues, who do you recommend?" Just like you go to your family doctor, what therapist do you recommend? That's where people find out things. I think that also the other thing is that compared to generations past, men do not belong to fraternal organizations as much.
Right.
I'm a Mason, and I find being with the guys and Masons that makes me a stronger person to deal with the adversity of life. Now, I've got a little preface here, because I don't writing books. I'm not making a lot of money on it because they go to the humanitarian program. We're not supposed to use Masonry to make profit. But since this is
Right.
so I'm writing my books for another purpose, I feel okay by saying that. But I think that that's one of the things that you do. If you already have those friendships, you already have that buddy. But I think that very often that men are generally isolated. The number of bowling leagues was going down, and then with COVID, it went close to zero. It's building up a little bit, but that kind of socialization just can make you stronger and deal with it. So if you want to talk to your buddy after bowling, "Hey man, this is just that maybe," and now you maybe get bad advice. That's the one thing that a lot of people, when they give advice, they give it from their point of view, and maybe with a little self-serving, hopefully not with some self-serving, but sometimes unintentionally.
Right.
So sometimes you do need professional help to sort out from what, am I really being reasonable, or do I really have something I have to work on?
It's a good point, Lance. I agree. And it's funny that you said that, because I have seen a decrease in a lot of men's social groups and men gatherings and things like that. Just getting together and after COVID. So I can see where that would definitely play a part. I absolutely do.
And even to your point with, you may get bad advice. Sometimes it just feels good to get it out. I have, a few guys that I associate with, and I know this one particular guy, I know he's not going to give me what I need. I know it, but I still feel good for me to say, "Hey, look, man, this is what's happening." His best to me would probably be, "Hey, man, keep your head up." That's not enough.
But it's
You know what I mean? But I knew that going in, and I'm a firm believer of you got to know your peoples, and you got to, deal with them, accept them for who they are. So
I think sometimes saying something out loud to yourself, "Oh, see how I sound," and just saying out loud, you give some reflection. Not to diminish anything from professional therapists, but sometimes just saying what you say out loud, you hear yourself and "Oh yeah, that's pretty petty," or maybe that is pretty serious. Yeah,
right.
Go either way. Yeah,
Right.
Lance, you have been absolutely amazing. This
Yes,
has been very
absolutely.
insightful. We can hear the knowledge and your experience.
Good information.
We thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I'm going to put all of your information, your contact information, your foundation information below, so everyone hopefully can
Your book?
contribute. Yes, your books, exactly. You are absolutely been great. We thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having
Appreciate
me.
you.
It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir, and we appreciate it.
Okay.
I'm lucky. Let him
Guys,
know.
have a good day.
Roscoe Squeeze off.
You too. Thank you. Your
Richie
boy
B.
Richie B.
Men suffer in silence.
Till next time.
All right, Lance.
Little Lance.
All right.